words of my mouth and the meditation of our heart be pleasing and acceptable to you, O God. Amen. Good morning, good people. It sort of reminds me of Good Morning Vietnam, that greeting from the 1987 movie with Robin Williams in it. Good morning, good people was St. Francis of Assisi's typical greeting as he walked barefoot through his villages. In contrast to the rich fool in our gospel reading this morning, St. Francis was known as God's fool, a title he even affirmed himself. My brothers, he said, God has called me by the way of humility and showed me the way of simplicity. The Lord told me what he wanted. He wanted me to be a new fool in the world. And he was. His birth name was John, or Giovanni in Italian. He was born into a very wealthy family in Italy in 1182, so 836 or something years ago, or more, 38 years. His father was a very wealthy Umbrian cloth merchant, and his mother was French. But following a family trip to France where the young Giovanni was captivated by the markets and the music and the women and the poetry, his father began calling him Francesco, the Frenchman, or Francis of Assisi. And Francis, who was groomed for the family business, however, as a teenager, was far more interested in romance than commerce. In fact, he was famous among the youth of Assisi for throwing wild parties, providing bountiful flow of wine, disappearing into darkened rooms with women, strolling the streets until dawn, and singing the love songs of the troubadours. His primary ambition as a young man, nurtured no doubt by the 13th century medieval myths of knights and noble ladies, was to be adored as a hero. Until around the age of 19, and Francis joined the war against Perugia, where he was captured by the enemy, and this time as a prisoner of war took a whole new direction, of course, for Francis. He had lots of time to think and to self-reflect, and he was confronted by how shallow his life had been up to that point. And he even began contemplating God and listening for God's voice. After spending a year in a prison dungeon and becoming quite ill, lucky his father was rich, he was able to pay a ransom to have Francis released, but Francis was never the same. God had begun a deep work in him, and he began to see things very differently around him. His eyes were open to poverty around him. Whilst his family were rich and had plenty, others were extremely poor and wanting. And through a series of visions from God and a sense of call from God, Francis was transformed from the inside out. What he once considered important, he now considered as nothing. What he once rejected, he now embraced. He no longer cared about being comfortable. Instead, he wanted to give comfort. He wasn't interested in a full belly when all those around him were suffering and with starvation. Wherever Francis went, it seemed he heard the whisper of the Holy One guiding him into a life of loving service. And one day, as he took shelter from the hot sun in an ancient church outside the city gates, Francis heard the voice of Christ address him from the crucifix on the wall and tell him to rebuild his church. It was another significant turning point in Francis's life. He raced home and grabbed handfuls of expensive fabric from his father's storeroom and sold it below market price and donated the money to the bewildered priest at the dilapidated church. And his father, when he found out, of course, dragged his son before the Bishop of Assisi and demanded recompense for what Francis had stolen from him. And as Francis stood before the bishop, who was dressed more like a prince than a follower of the barefoot Jesus Christ, and as his seething father, who had no time for God and no heart for the poor, cursed him, suddenly everything became clear for Francis. Everything, he thought, belongs to God. Everything on earth belongs to the Holy One. How could we do anything but praise the Creator of all and serve all and give all our best to him? And in a wild burst of joy, Francis stripped off his fine clothes and laid them before his father's feet, renounced his inheritance, and embraced a life of radical poverty in solidarity with the people. And stark naked, he walked away from the only life he had ever known, and he never returned. And his infuriated father stormed off, and the embarrassed bishop took off his cape to cover Francis' nakedness, but was moved by what he saw in this young man who was surrendering himself to the one who gave his all for us. The world was Francis's oyster, but he gave it all up. Worldly wealth, status, and power. He shunned the lot and vowed instead to live a life of simplicity, poverty, and prayer. His family disowned him. His father tried to lock him up for a time until his mum rescued him. Yay, mum. Many of his friends just thought that he'd gone mad, that it was ridiculous being kind to the poor. But Francis had encountered Jesus and felt very called to follow him and preach to all of creation, to the rich, to the poor, to the lonely, to the dying, even to the animals. And he did. He preached that the world was good and beautiful. Instead of beginning with original sin, Francis' starting point was original blessing. He believed we all have a duty to protect and enjoy nature as stewards of God's creation. He believed nature itself was the mirror of God, and he called all creatures, even the moon and the sun, and the stars, brothers and sisters. He maintained God was in all things, every single creature full of God, and a book about God. St. Francis shows us what it means to follow Jesus and be good news in a broken world. One of my favourite stories about St. Francis, and I wrote about it in the Salt magazine a few years ago, but I think it's worth repeating, is his encounter with a leper. Walking home one night, his path crossed a leper, and recoiling in fear, he went to move away. But the Spirit of God tugged on his heart. So being careful not to touch the man's hands, he just dropped a couple of coins into his hands and quickly went to move on. However, God wasn't done with him, and he felt the urge to give him his blanket. And so he did, by basically throwing it onto the shoulders of the leper. But still God wasn't finished with him. Francis was led to take the man's face covered with sores between the palm of his hands and kiss him with tenderly love. And following it, to his surprise, the leper vanished. And Francis realised that the leper was Christ himself. And so from that moment, Francis' circle got larger and larger, as it always does when we give our hearts over to love. To Francis, no one was on the outside. Everyone was included. Francis was eager to love all. To Francis, there was no who's in and who's out. He reminds us of the basic invitation Christ extends to all of us. Will you walk the way of love and compassion with me? Will you love all? Will you reach out to all, especially to the poor, the vulnerable and forgotten? Will you let me expand your heart and be my hands and feet in a broken world. Good morning, good people. Words that embodied a grateful heart for the gift of life each new day. Words that embodied a belief that all are good and precious. I think we have so much to learn from St. Francis, who reminds us to be fools for God, not rich fools, like Jesus warns us about in the Gospel reading today. Let me pray. Praise to you, St. Francis of Assisi, brother to the sun and the moon, to birds and worms, fire and wind. Your unconditional love of creation excludes no one. When you embraced the leper, anything left between you and your God melted away. Wise fool of God, teach us to embrace radical simplicity and the joy of letting go and giving our all to God. Whisper in our ear, Francis. Let us live your simple wisdom and teach not through the words of our mind, but through the actions of our heart. May we seek not much to be understood as to understand, to be loved and to love. Thank you. Amen.